All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Daria Shapovalova, and I'm the chair of the Scottish Arctic Network. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to a webinar today. And I will hand over to Lauren to chair the actual talk in a minute. But first, I just wanted to thank you all for your time and for joining us during your lunchtime, or if you're in a different time zone of whatever the time it is. We have a series of webinars, and a few webinars have already occurred, and you can see the recordings of them on the website arctic.scot. This webinar will be recorded as well. And the video will appear on the website after a couple of days. We have one more webinar to go next week by Keith Torrance on remediation, and you can see all the details again on arctic.scot with a free registration too. In other news, if you're a member of ScAN, we will have a meeting of all ScAN members during the Arctic Science Summit Week in March in Edinburgh, so please do join. And we share quarterly newsletters, so if you have any news updates on your research, please do get in touch, and we can feature it on the website, on our social media, and in a newsletter as well. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Lauren McWhinnie.
Thanks, Daria. I'm just muting everybody here just because I think a couple folks had their microphones on, so if you're joining, don't worry, I think I've got everybody now. So it's my great pleasure to be asked to kind of introduce Emily. So Emily is, poor long-suffering Emily is a PhD researcher with me here at Heriot-Watt, and despite my best efforts, she's doing a magnificent job of navigating her PhD research. But what she's going to be presenting on here is actually a piece of work that we've been doing on the side of her main research, because as if undertaking a PhD wasn't enough of a full-time task, Emily has also been doing some work with me on a project called Epicenter, which is an EU-funded project under the Horizon 2020 scheme. It's coming into its final year now, sadly, but this is one of the pieces of work that we've been doing that looks more specifically at the evidence that we currently have for how whales might be impacted by Arctic shipping. I won't say too much more though, because obviously Emily's going to do this big, massive spoilers about what we know and what we don't know. But Emily, please take it away, and thank you so much for coming and giving a talk for ScANs today.
Hi, thank you, Lauren. Thanks, Daria, and thank you everyone else that's here for coming along as well. So yeah, I'm going to be presenting this work that's, like Lauren was saying, it's not one part of my PhD, but it's part of a short contract that I've been doing with the Epicenter project, which is a European Horizon funded project. But the work represented here represents what me and Lauren have been doing as part of that project. I should also say that the kind of body of work that I'm going to present is currently, we've written it up into a publication which is in review at the moment. So just asking anybody not to share or shout too much about, especially the results slide on Twitter or online too much. But I guess it's kind of my first time presenting it, so you can consider the results very hot off the press. And it'll be really interesting to hear what everybody thinks about it, because it's the first time kind of sharing what we've found with the outside world, apart from me and Lauren being super excited about all the results that we've found. So I look forward to questions and hearing anybody's thoughts. So first, I know this is the Scottish Arctic Network, but I see lots of non-Arctic attendees, but let's all take ourselves north and think about what do we mean when we're talking about Arctic whales. So there's lots of cetacean species, so marine mammal species that utilise Arctic waters temporarily. They might visit seasonally, things like humpback whales or killer whales, but there are only 3 species of cetacean that are considered endemic, or that we'd refer to as Arctic whales. And these are found year-round in Arctic waters. So that's the bowhead whale, which is the only resident baleen whale in the Arctic, and then the narwhal, so that's the one on the big picture on the slide here, and then the beluga or the white whale. So the beluga and the narwhal are closely related toothed whales. So these whales form a really essential component of the survival and the culture and the identity of Indigenous peoples in the Arctic and part of Arctic heritage. They provide sustenance and food security to a lot of Arctic communities. But then since about the 1600s, these Arctic whales, particularly the bowhead, have also been exploited by commercial whaling operations, primarily driven by rising prices of oil and demand for whale oil over in Europe. So the volume of commercial whaling is reduced and now stopped. But subsistence hunting of these whales still takes place. But I just wanted to point this out because for hundreds of years, I guess this heavy commercial whaling was one of the main and only ways that these Arctic whales were being affected by humans. But things have changed quite a lot for the Arctic in kind of the past 150 years or so. So the threats that they're facing from humans is changing also. So like I was saying, we've got this increasing global human footprint coupled with industrialization. Developing technology means that the Arctic's getting more and more accessible with lots of commercial interest in it, which means that Arctic whales are increasingly co-occurring and being exposed to rising numbers of anthropogenic activities, including shipping, fishing, fossil fuel extraction, and fossil fuel exploration as well. Some Arctic locations, the remoteness or the harshness of the weather conditions is limited the amount that humans have managed to get to it. But with sea ice and the changing extreme temperatures, changing navigability of the Arctic, we're beginning to see exposure for these more remote subpopulations also changing. Whereas before it might have been rare and limited for Arctic whales to come across these types of activities, it's now getting more and more common for these types of activities to be occurring in the Arctic. So even things like cruise tourism is increasing up there. So along with anthropogenic induced climate change result in increasing air and sea surface temperatures in the Arctic, but also prolonged ice-free summer seasons, along with coupled reduction in sea ice thickness and extent. In shipping terms, this means again an increasingly navigable Arctic. So ships taking routes all the way through the Arctic, or maybe adding additional destinations where they're visiting the Arctic. So there's longer durations that ships can get through, and there's also less reliance. So ships traditionally used to have to undergo the big expense and I guess headache of organising icebreaking vessels to get through the Arctic. And only ice-class vessels traditionally would go through the Arctic due to the sea ice and the conditions. But more and more, especially in recent years, we're beginning to hear about non-ice-class vessels going through the Arctic. There's questions about safety, but that's a whole other talk in itself. But also vessels going up there that are no longer requiring icebreakers. So the Arctic overall is just getting more navigable, and there's just increasing interest in the Arctic. Cruise ships are going up there more and more. I've heard anecdotal stories of cruise ships going in places that increasingly, like 30 years ago, they couldn't get to. And the same with cargo vessels going through previously inaccessible or dangerous passengers. So these graphs on the slide are from PAIM. So this is the protection of the Arctic marine environment, and they just show how the number of unique ships going through the Arctic and the total distance sailed in the Arctic has increased. These graphs are from 2013. So what does this mean for Arctic whales? So given the predicted and continued increases in vessel-based activity in the Arctic, it's really imperative that we understand the current and potential consequences for Arctic whales. This knowledge is really important so managers, policymakers, scientists can understand and make informed decisions about how best to reduce the impacts for Arctic whales from this increase in shipping. So like I was saying, there's so many of these stocks and subpopulations have traditionally not really been exposed to much human activity at all. So to do this, the first thing that we kind of need to do is get a lay of the land of what do we know already about how these whales respond to marine vessels and the activities that the vessels are doing. So to do this, we conducted what's called a systematic review. And that's basically just a way of summarising the current state of knowledge of what do we know already. And that'll give us an idea of where we can focus research, of where we've got gaps in knowledge, what do we not know as well, which is the main thing that we wanted to get out of this, is that where are the knowledge gaps that need to be addressed before this the rise in human activity in the Arctic continues, and how best can we manage that. So to do this, we use specific predefined search terms and conduct searches in a number of different search engines. We found just over 4,500 documents with their specific search terms, which were very much focused on vessels and Arctic. So I went through all of those articles. Some magical software called Ryan helped a lot with getting rid of duplicates. And then we had a second reviewer who screened 15% of the documents. And by screening, I just mean we're going through and reading the abstract, which is the short summary of what's in the article, to look at whether it's relevant. So is it about Arctic whales, and is it about the vessels or response to vessels? And then we decide whether or not the document's relevant to our review. Then we go and look for the full text, and once we've got those full text together and double check that they're all relevant and should be included, we ended up altogether with 169 documents that were included in our final review. So that's what I'm going to present the results of. So to get the kind of results or the traditional data that you'd think about with other scientific experiments, what you do is for each document in basically a ginormous Excel spreadsheet, you go through and you pull information about the whale responses or predicted responses to vessels, and you pull out the same information for every article. So we're pulling out species type, vessel type, where the study was conducted, where the institution was that conducted the study, what journal was it published in, was it a report or a PhD thesis or a publication, and this kind of gives us the data that we can then dive into to summarize and then present the results. So that's what I get to show you now, which is super exciting. So what did the review find? So the majority of the 169 documents were peer review articles. So just to talk you through this graph, the turquoise bars show peer review publications like I was talking about. Then in purple, we've got reports. Along the bottom of the graph is year. So you can see that the first publication was in 1953. So this was a report about Western Hudson Bay beluga whales, and they were documenting that the beluga whales were progressively becoming more responsive and frightened of an approaching motorboat. So that was the first record we found in our review, at least, of Arctic whales responding at all to vessels, or the acknowledgement that this might be impactful to these species. So you can see after that first report in the literature, there wasn't really a mention of this for 30 or so years until the 80s, when you start to see a rise in publications. You see lots of purple in the 80s, and this generally is, we think, mostly attributed to the US being really interested in exploring oil off the top of Alaska, basically in the Arctic, and that drove funding into figuring out how that potentially might be affecting bowhead whales, and largely because of indigenous communities there noticing that the bowheads were potentially responding to oil and gas exploration activity. So there was a bit of a drive in funding in that period. So we think that's what those purple bars there. But overall, you can kind of see that on this axis is the number of publications per year. So even in the busiest year of publications, there was only 12 contributions to the literature on this topic. So overall, really not a whole heap of research going into this topic, even on the, I guess, the busy publication years. But we can see a kind of an increasing trend in the knowledge that's been added to the literature on this. I also mapped out study locations. So like I was saying, when I went through each article, we recorded where the study location was taking place. So this map has got the different species of study in different colours. So belugas purple, bowheads orange, and narwhals in pink, sorry. And you can see where the study location happened. And this is just kind of to give an idea of the distribution of where studies are occurring. And again, on the graph that's broken down in more detail. So you can see study locations spanned the principal range states of the Arctic, so Canada, the US, Russia, Norway, and Greenland. Though there was, you can see from the graph, there's a hell of a lot of more studies where the location is primarily in Canada or the US. And we actually kind of found the same, I've not showed it on this slide, but lead author institution location as well was really heavily skewed towards North America, so to Canada and America, with much more limited contributions to the literature on this topic from other institutions. So for example, there was 2 studies that had come from institutions in Denmark, 2 from France, 4 from Greenland, and 1 from Norway, and 5 from Russia. So I guess North America is kind of dominating the research scene in terms of where the institutions are the research is coming out of. So now diving a bit more into the actual, what did we find, species specific things. So this map here demonstrates the stock distributions of belugas. So you can see in the lilacs and the pinks, that's where belugas go year round, some in summer and some in winter in the dark purple. And the stocks on the slide are estimated to be 21 recognized stocks of belugas, 19 that are actually in the circumpolar Arctic, and then 2 that are resident in subarctic waters. So the St. Lawrence Estuary in Quebec in Canada, and Cook Inlet in Alaska. So, and then the 19 others are considered more in Arctic waters. So the text on the slide is basically the stock names. So the idea behind these maps is to show where study locations are versus where the stocks are. So immediately, like from a map, you can begin to see that this Barents Kara Laptev Sea stock of belugas has only got 1 study star in its distribution range. We also color-coded the stars of where the research is going, along with what did the study record. So some studies were directly observing response or an impact from vessels, whereas others were predicting responses. So they were predicting whether or not they expected, say, the vessels to be audible in the region that they were studying. And then other studies were predicting that they would expect belugas not to respond. And then other studies, quite a lot of studies actually, were looking at whether or not an overlap with vessel traffic was even observed in the area where those species were. So kind of mapping where vessels are with where the belugas are, and figuring out whether they expected there to be an overlap and a potential impact at all. So very predictive studies, not necessarily actually looking into observations of response. So we've color coded those maps on there of what they were finding as well. And then we can dive into more detail for each stock. So we were really interested in how the research, I guess, was distributed between the stocks of belugas. So the Sankey diagram here shows that there were 300 records we found in the review and put into our database of some sort of beluga response to vessels, or predicted response, or overlap predicted or not predicted. So of that, we then split it up into the different stocks of belugas to figure out whether some stocks were being more heavily studied than others. So you can see from this that that is the case, it looks like. And then so we've also got the flags here of the primary countries that these stocks are occupying the waters of, and then the squares with the arrows up and down, these are showing the predicted population trajectories. So red is the decreasing, green increasing predicted populations, and you can see that there's a lot of grey question marks, which is, in other words, is data deficient. We don't really know what the population trajectory is doing. You can see by the width of the bars that some stocks have got a much greater volume of studies and research focus than others. So the 5 beluga stocks that occupy a portion of the Okhotsk Sea all have only 2 or 3 data records per stock. So that's the ones right up in the top of the Sankey diagram here. They've all got this population trend of recorded as unknown. So the two stocks with the highest volume of data records were both those subarctic stocks that I was talking about earlier, the St. Lawrence Estuary and the Cook Inlet belugas. Both of these have got declining population trajectories, so this may have in part encouraged comparatively higher volumes of studies and research into vessel impacts. However, it's interesting to notice that also the Cumberland Sound population are thought known to be declining. However, the stocks only got 2 data records. So I guess the population trend is perhaps not only the primary driver of research effort. Another possibility is that the Cook Inlet and the St. Lawrence Estuary belugas both occupy heavily trafficked estuaries, both within proximity to ports and harbours, along with established wildlife watching trips in both the areas that they're occupying. So that might have also driven research effort, along with, I guess, proximity to research institutions that can do it, and they're in a bit more of a human populace, maybe easier to study region. So that's what we've trying to get out of these Sankey diagrams, and I guess the study itself is just to identify what do we know about how belugas and these stocks are responding to vessels, but also we can see here that despite it looking like there's 305 records for vessel responses or predictions of responses, that actually for some stocks we really know super little. And I guess an important point to note, or a good discussion point for the question time, is actually that even though one stock responds to vessels, that doesn't mean that another stock would. So the Cook Inlet belugas and the St. Lawrence Estuary belugas, like I was saying, occupy really heavily trafficked areas, so they may or may not respond in a certain way that others that live in more, I guess, quiet, less heavily trafficked environments might respond very differently. So the observations are not necessarily very transferable either. So we kind of recommend that it's really important to ensure that we're studying all these different stocks to understand how they're going to respond to increasing vessel activity. So we'll move on to the next slide now, which is about narwhals. So they're kind of the same maps and distribution maps. So this time we're looking at narwhal distribution in blues and turquoises, and you can see that these are much more heavily focused around the Atlantic Arctic. So that big grey landmass in the middle there is Greenland. So globally there are thought to be about 123,000 narwhals, with an unknown overall population trajectory. And of that, the global population comprises 12 stocks, each with again differing or unknown population trajectories. So their distribution, like I was saying, is centered around Greenland and off the east coast of Canada here, and this is Iceland, just to orient you a bit there. And again, from this map, you can kind of see there's areas of the distribution that there's really not been much studies contributing to the literature on this. And then we dive into the Sankey diagram. So there are 80 records with regards to narwhal responses to vessels and their associated activity. This was from only 24 documents though. And the volume of data records per stock was low. So if you can remember the numbers from the belugas before, this is quite different. So there's only 5 of the 12 stocks. 3 of the 12 stocks that have got more than 5 records of their potential responses to vessels at all. In other words, we know really little for a lot of these stocks about how they're responding to vessels. I should say as well, I should have mentioned it on the slide before, that once that on the right hand side of these Sankey diagrams is where we separate whether or not the studies were predictive studies, like I was talking about earlier, whether they were predicting overlap, predicting audibility, whether they were actually observing responses, so acoustic responses or observations of behavioural responses to vessels, or whether they were predicting no response or overlap. So, for example, predicting that there wasn't going to be any overlap between vessel traffic and where the narwhals actually are, or whether no response was observed. So this gives us a good indication of whether the literature is actually doing predictions and what we expect versus actual observational responses. So if we go on to bowheads now, globally, bowhead whales are actually thought to be increasing, which is good news. And the global population can be divided into 4 subpopulations, but the stories of those subpopulations are actually quite different. The 2 smallest subpopulations, the Okhotsk and the East Greenland Svalbard Barents Sea populations, are both estimated to only be up to around 250 individuals, and consequently have both been classified by the IUCN as endangered. And you can see the already small Okhotsk Sea subpopulation up here is actually thought to be decreasing as well. But in contrast, the Bering Chukchi Beaufort Sea is estimated to have around 19,000 individuals in that population, in this paler pink here. So we recorded 200 data records referring to bowhead responses to vessels. But again, you can see a big disparity between the number of data records per subpopulation. Both those endangered subpopulations that I was talking about, the Okhotsk and the East Greenland Svalbard Barents Sea, each only have got 4 or 7 data records respectively, in comparison to this much more well-studied Bering Chukchi Beaufort Sea population. But actually, I think like I mentioned at the start about drivers behind research, the Bering Chukchi Beaufort Sea would actually have been the population that would have been studied by that oil and gas interest in the 70s and the 80s of the north of Alaska. So that might be where a bit of the research has been coming from anyway. Again, you can see quite a few of the studies of bowheads have actually been about observational responses, but again, quite a lot about predictive studies as well. So given the small population sizes of these, especially the top 2 subpopulations of bowheads, we kind of find it, I guess you can argue with me about this, but I think it's pretty alarming that this population especially is thought to be decreasing. There's less than 300 individuals in either of these populations, and we know so little about how they respond to vessels, or how they might respond to future increases in vessel traffic. So this is one of the key take-home messages. I think I've got it on the next slide just to really drive it home, that we know so little about some endangered and really small subpopulations in the Arctic. They're really understudied. A lot of them have just only ever had predictive studies done to understand or predict responses to vessels, rather than even knowing how they might respond. So yeah, I really want to drive home this key message from this review, is that we really know very little about a lot of endangered subpopulations. Another thing we wanted to dive into as well was to figure out whether or not these studies actually even overlap with where Arctic vessel activity actually is. So are we studying vessel impacts in areas where vessels actually are? So to do this, we used Arctic ship traffic data from PAIM, so PAIM, the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment that I mentioned before. So they provide vessel data for the whole of the Arctic. So this is AIS data. We only present 2019 AIS data here because we figured that was probably a good representative year of Arctic vessel traffic before the pandemic affected and reduced vessel traffic. We've cropped the data set from the whole Arctic down to just where Arctic whales distribution is expected to be. And then we've presented the vessel traffic data as density. So the darker green represents higher levels of Arctic vessel densities. And just, I guess, an important point to know that we couldn't find equivalent data for the Okhotsk Sea area. So that's crosshatch, and we didn't get, I guess, the equivalent data AIS data sets for the St. Lawrence estuary either. But the point of overlaying where vessels are with where the studies were is just to highlight that there's very busy, well-trafficked areas, like if you look along the north coast of Norway and Russia, but there's very limited studies being done there. So again, the stars just show locations of studies, and they're coloured by what species it's on. So we'll dive into this briefly on here, but like I mentioned, this is in review and hopefully going to be published soon. So if you're interested, you'll get to dive into this in much more detail, but I'll just go over it quickly now. So we subset the AIS data into the specific vessel types, and we also then subset the review data into specific vessel types. So here on this map is showing cruise ship data, cruise ship density in 2019, and you can see some really specific routes going over and over again, but let's say between Iceland and Svalbard back to the north coast of Norway, and through the Bering Strait. But you can see as well that there are vessel-related studies or looking at responses or predicting responses of Arctic whales to cruise ships has been super limited, and it's not covered all of the areas where Arctic whales actually are. And you can see that at the moment there are no studies in our review that included responses of narwhals to cruise ships, even though cruise ships definitely go through areas where narwhals occupy. Moving on to oil and gas related vessels, so this is mainly oil and gas tankers vessel traffic mapped here, and then where the studies were. So you can see, like I was talking about before, the heavy volume of studies from reports in the 80s on bowhead whales in the north coast that was driven by this oil and gas related interest up there. But there are lots of areas in Arctic whales distribution that haven't been studied that have definitely got oil and gas related vessels going through them. So you can see, again, the north coast of Norway and Russia, there's currently no studies we found in our review that look into how whales might respond to them. So passenger vessels, so this includes ferries, tour boats, including wildlife watching trips, which is increasing in the Arctic, especially Arctic wildlife watching. You can see that they kind of follow set routes, especially ferries, of course, but again, studies are limited, and again, still no studies of how narwhals respond to whale watching vessels found by our review. Fishing vessel activity, so you can see again quite heavy volumes of activity in some Arctic waters, but limited studies that actually overlap with where these heavy volumes of fishing activity are. Again, no studies on narwhals in response to fishing vessels. The idea behind these maps is kind of to drive where research could or should be done, where we've got gaps in our knowledge of how species respond to these vessel types, more specific vessel types, and kind of a good way to really identify where those knowledge gaps are and where we don't really know about certain areas or how certain species will respond to certain vessel types. So goods vessels, you can see that there actually has been quite a bit of research into potential or predicted responses to goods vessels, particularly for narwhals. So here, I think this research, so the pink is narwhals, and you can see that here there's an iron ore mine that takes iron ore in and out from a mine up there by vessels, and they've I guess through pressure from the community have kind of had to explore their potential responses for narwhals and other species that are important to Indigenous communities. So that's probably the driver for a lot of the stars up here. But I guess it's nicer to see a bit more of a spread of the research covering wider areas, but still plenty of areas with no research stars on it yet. And then miscellaneous. So this, you can't take too much from this graph simply because the miscellaneous vessel types in the vessel data itself included all sorts of things like tugs, motorboats, icebreakers and seaplanes, but I just wanted to map those last bits of vessel data along with where the studies were, just so you've got a full complete view of the different vessel types and what studies are going on in the Arctic. The final graph, I promise, from me for today is also showing how we can compare between species and between vessel types. So when I was talking about pulling all that data into the Excel spreadsheet and you're describing which vessel type the study is on, it allows us to make graphs like this, which then let us look at the variation in the volume of data records per vessel type category. So you can see that the most commonly studied vessel category was oil and gas related vessels, followed by goods vessels. But also here you can really see again, but with numbers, that there's really limited research contribution so far on cruise ships, responses to cruise ships, to fishing vessels, to tugboats, to human powered vessels like kayaks, rowboats, paddle boards. I really wanted to highlight this because there's some vessel types that are increasing in the Arctic that are definitely going further north or in places that they weren't particularly before, especially cruise ships. Yet we know so little about how these animals might respond to those vessel types that are increasing in their activity. So hopefully this can be used by people to really drive and show people that we need research funding to be studying in these vessel types that are increasing, because cruise ships, wildlife watching vessels, they're actively going to be going out to look for interactions with these whales. So better understanding how the whales might respond or be impacted by that is really important to ensure our increasing human footprint on the Arctic is properly managed. So in the paper, we make a series of recommendations based on what we found in the review. I'll summarise them quickly here, but mainly is what I was trying to talk about halfway through and drive home, is that we really recommend further studies of these understudied species, subpopulations and stocks. So those ones that we really don't know much about, and like I was talking about before, you can't necessarily say that just because one stock responds in one way that another will respond the same, because they've got such different exposure histories. So we'd really recommend further studies of all the stocks, especially those understudied ones. Further studies of vessel types that have got their increasing presence in the Arctic, such as those things like cruise ships that I was talking about, wildlife watching vessels. How do Arctic ship transits affect whales if they're going to be increasing? Further studies of underrepresented vessel-related stresses. So anecdotally, we didn't record this, but we really noticed that a lot of the studies were really looking into the noise from vessels and not necessarily thinking about other stresses posed to vessels, like pollution, like the strike risk, like the disturbance in behaviour just by the presence of being there. So we really would recommend a bit more of a holistic overview of how the different stresses can affect Arctic whales. We also, like I was talking about, a lot of the studies are very predictive. So they'll be mapping where the vessel data is along with where the whales are thought to be, and then say that we predict that there may or may not be an overlap, so there may or may not be an impact. But really, we need to kind of dive into this in more detail and get some proper evidence of how these whales are responding, or to understand and kind of give evidence to managers if this needs to be adapted. And I guess on the note of management, we really recommend development of proactive and adaptive management measures for Arctic vessel traffic. So we know that Arctic ship traffic is increasing. We know that a lot of these species have previously been really had limited exposure to vessels, so just trying to think in advance about where we can put in adaptive management measures. So maybe slowdowns or areas that you're not allowed to go through because these are really important for vessels. So can you take a route diversion, and trying to work with shippers and operators to reduce those impacts to Arctic whales proactively and in advance rather than in hindsight. So that's been a kind of a whistle-stop tour into what we've been doing as part of the Epicenter project. I want to say a big shout out to the people on this slide. Also to those, I know it's Kovacs is here. She provided the amazing stock distribution maps for narwhal. So this has been quite a monumental effort. It's not just me and Lauren that's been doing this. So I just wanted to thank everybody that's been part of this. I'd love to hear any questions or any thoughts on what we've found, and what you think about it. But if you don't get a chance to ask here, please do contact me on Twitter or drop me an email. I'd be really pleased to hear from you, and I really look forward to any questions or thoughts anybody's got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. I feel like this is the one thing with virtual talks, it's still not great in terms of not being able to give you a clap at the end of it. But yeah, that was an amazing amount of information distilled very succinctly into the last half hour. So thank you so much for that. The questions are already coming thick and fast on the chat here, which is fantastic. I don't know, if people are still here, if you'd like to ask your own questions. Catherine, I don't know if people have access to microphone. If not, I can absolutely read them out. I don't know if
I might stop sharing just so I can see everybody's faces a bit better.
Oh, but then we've got this lovely picture of you hugging a bowhead. So I don't know, Catherine, if you are here. If not, I can read it out. Don't think. Maybe. Okay, so I'll just crack on. So Catherine's asking Emily, how are the hypothetical areas of narwhal distribution determined and identified?
Okay, I'm gonna throw the first question right back out there. I don't know if
I think it was actually from a working group in terms of some of those hypothetical areas.
yeah. I was going to say if Kit or anybody else is on the call who actually might be able to answer this better than me, who was actually involved in those distribution maps being developed, it would be good. Like, please feel free to unmute yourself if you're able to, or to add to the chat, because I've just kind of used those shape files to plug into the research that we found, but I'm not entirely sure all of the process of the figuring out the distributions, but Kate was here and I know she did the belugas and potentially the narwhal ones, or was part of the working group of that, so be good to
sure if
get anybody's input.
It's online. I see Nancy, I don't know if you have a question or if it's relation to this point.
Hi, I do have a question. Thank you so much for the talk. It was absolutely brilliant and so comprehensive. I've only just begun to read more and more about Arctic shipping because I've worked for many years in Mitimachilik or Pond Inlet on Baffin Island, and over my research over the last few years, there's been a ongoing concern on the part of people in Arctic Bay and in Pond Inlet about Arctic shipping and the iron ore mine and the cruise ships and all of the vessels going back and forth from the iron ore mine. It's a bit of an ominous atmosphere sometimes there during narwhal hunting season when the narwhal aren't there, and so I've been there several times over the last few years, and every time I've been there, there's been all kinds of community meetings with the Kikiktanik Inuit Association, the government of Nunavut, various different workshops, and all of the hunters and translators and community members are really busy documenting knowledge about, and you had mentioned this holistic approach towards narwhal populations or whale populations more generally, and I'm just wondering whether some of that information that's documented in the different gray literature, as you'd call it in Canada probably, but whether that might be added to your list of recommendations is the documentation that's taking place by Indigenous people in those communities.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and what an interesting place to be working in the changing, I guess, landscape, but like you say, a bit scarily changing. So we did document this, but we've not presented it in the results or the paper, but I was really interested to know, like you say, how much contribution from traditional, I guess, knowledge was going into the literature. And I have to say, like, it was horrifyingly small to say how much knowledge there is. I think off the top of my head, I can really remember about like 5 out of the 160 documents, maybe 169 documents. I think I'm probably overestimating it. 5 were actually reports that were directly documenting knowledge from Indigenous communities who know a hell of a lot more than any other research team going up for a week of a year. So yeah, I totally agree that there should be such a drive for the research to be coming from there, but also for the adaptive management and the solutions and the mitigation to all be driven by those that are based up there and that are most affected by that as well. So yeah, I think there absolutely is room to add that into the recommendations.
Yeah, well, it's super tricky because a lot of this people are working really hard, the knowledge holders in the communities, to get this documentation down as the older generations are passing on, right? And yet a lot of that knowledge is held in gray literature and government reports and those sorts of things. So I just wonder whether there might be something that people could look at,
Yeah, I should say that our review did include grey literature, so like reports and any of those like government documents like you were talking about. So if you'd find them on Google Scholar or anything like that, then they would have appeared in our search, but it wasn't a comprehensive search of like every government record or whatever. So they may have flown under the radar and been missed. But I think a kind of problem with the traditional literature review style is that it only includes peer review scientific literature, and I think that's why we really wanted to make sure that this knowledge isn't always getting through into the traditional scientific peer review ways, and actually there's other ways that it's being reported, like these reports. So we did try and include it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a bit missing just from the methods that we used.
Oh, I think your methods were great. I just
and in different languages too. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
It's acknowledging that there might be publications in other languages that the search terms don't, So it's a start. It's I'm conscious of the time and getting some more questions, but thank you so much for that, Nancy. And I think it's a hugely important. I suspect we're all not surprised the lack of, but it doesn't make it right either. And it's such an under-tapped resource of knowledge. It's just,
it's a work in progress. Yeah,
exactly.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
In between them, yeah.
Killian, I see you've got. I don't know if you're still online in terms of asking your question. If you want to put it to Emily, or I can do it for you. In terms of a meeting. No, I'll do it for Emily, although everybody can see it. So, Killian was wondering about the different types of responses a whale might have towards different types of ships. So do we expect the same responses from a cruise ship, say, versus a cargo ship, for example?
Okay, this is a really important point, which I totally skimmed over completely when I was separating the different vessel types up. So yes, absolutely, I think we would expect different responses, and a lot of this is to do with the way that these different vessel types behave. So cargo ships tend to be on very set routes, not stopping or looking for wildlife because they've got places to go and a time frame that they need to get somewhere. So they're traditionally would be staying in deeper, more navigable waters and just staying on set routes and at set speeds. But cruise ships are potentially out looking for wildlife and beautiful encounters, and have potentially will have zodiacs that are getting off the cruise ship as well, where there's a raft of people that want to be getting closer to the animals. So the cruise ships might, for example, not be staying on particularly set routes. They've got to obviously stay in safe waters, but there's the risk that they're definitely more likely to be looking for wildlife encounters than a cargo ship would be, for example. And then the other vessel types, like I was talking about, recreational vessels, for example, again, they're potentially able to go into shallower areas that might overlap more with certain species of marine mammals. So again, the behaviour might be less predictable for whales, so they might be changing course more often, slowing down, speeding up, difficult to predict and get out of the way of. And like I talked about noise before, but they've all got really different noise profiles, which can be more or less audible to the different species. So there's real nuance between the different vessel types, which is why we wanted to dive into how much research had been done between vessel types.
Thanks, Emily. Will, I see you've got your hand up, so I'll go to you first and then I'll go back to the chat.
Yeah, sure, thank you.
Oh, you're far away, Will.
Yep.
I did this yesterday as well. I keep doing this. I'm sorry. I was just saying thank you so much for your talk. It was excellent. I feel like I'm learning more about this subject every single day. I've got loads of questions, but I'll just ask one because we're running out of time. In terms of all the studies that you were looking at, I know obviously it was a broad overview and you weren't looking at the details, but I'm quite interested in knowing a bit more about how are these studies actually looking at the impacts of ships on whales? Like, what are they doing? Are they using specific methods? Are they field studies? Are they remote sensing studies? Are there gaps? Are there new ways in which we should be looking at the impacts? Do you have anything to say kind of on those ideas?
Yeah, there's a hell of a lot of different ways of looking into this. So I'll just reel off some examples, but this is not exhaustive at all. But the ones that I was talking about with the predictive studies might be like putting a hydrophone down and can you hear these whale making vocalizations, and can you hear vessels at the same time? And that's the extent of overlap. As far as it goes, that means that they're overlapping. More detailed studies of you can dive into whether or not the whales are responding acoustically to vessels. So do they increase or decrease the volume of the calls when there's vessel noise at the same time? But those studies are pretty rare for the Arctic whales. They've been done more commonly for, I guess, cetacean species a bit further south, but it was quite rare to find those types of studies. Also behavioural response studies. So if you go and watch the animals and see how they respond without boats there, and then see if there's any change in the behaviour when certain vessel types turn up, that was another type of study, but these were rare. But these are the types of studies where you really get an idea of the responses. Most of the studies were there are calls at the same time as vessel noise, or there are whales here in summer and boats go in here in summer, so there's potential for an impact, which is kind of useful to know where there's potential for impact, but we need to go a bit further into, is there an impact?
Cool, thank you. I won't ask a follow-up question, but I'll just be
Have
interested
you
to
got
know
time to
whether.
squeeze in a couple more, Daria? Are we good? Just there's a couple more questions. Yeah. Okay. Tessa, I see your. I don't know if you want to put it to Emily, or would you like me to do it for you if you've not got a. Oh, Tessa's here.
I can ask the question. Thanks, Lauren. Hi, Emily. A great talk as always. My question would be, if you could snap your fingers and get unlimited funding to study one particular region in the Arctic or a particular country that you know has high vessel traffic, but you know is currently understudied for impact, what region would you pick?
What a question. I think so. Our study found all of the species that are along the Russian coastline really understudied. However, our search was in English. We didn't exclude studies that weren't in a different language. I used the joy of Google Translator to try and understand as best as Google Translate could what the studies were about. So we didn't exclude any studies based on language, but we didn't conduct the search in any other language. But our review makes it look like they're really understudied, especially like from northern Norway right across the top of Russia right over to Alaska, I guess the Bering Strait. But there's a hell of a lot of vessel traffic up there. That's where we're thinking about this northern sea route going through. With China and Russia have made it very clear they want to put more vessels along that way. So I think that's an area that we don't, according to this review, we even have a baseline understanding of how these animals respond. So if we start studying in 50 or 100 years, we won't really know what was the baseline in the first place. But that is a very hot topic and contentious issue going to do any research up there at the moment.
Yeah. Cruise ships in Canada, Norway, Greenland areas would be. Yeah, and I think I have some other money, Tessa. I think cruise ships as well, though. I don't think tourists are really wanting to disturb animals. So, like, it's definitely an area that of untapped money, hopefully, that could be, I guess, to try and drive reducing impacts and conservation, whilst also going to visit and see them, but making sure it's done in a responsible way. Thanks for your question, Tessa.
Lots of money, please, Tessa.
As long as you give me some of that dream money.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Thanks.
Steph Moore, I don't know if you're already on it. Oh, can't hear you. Oh, typical.
Is that better?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting and very well presented. I was just curious about, with the increasing group of the wildlife watching vessels, whether there were any existing regulations in terms of approach distances and whether that varied for the different areas that you have these studies.
Yeah, so it varies loads, not even just country by country, but like area, like you say, as well. So like in the St. Lawrence estuary, there's rules about all vessel traffic around belugas and wildlife watching there. I don't know much about whether the rules are being adhered to. Lauren might be able to answer that better. But there's definitely plenty of areas where Arctic whales are, where there are no real regulations or even recommendations about how to behave around animals if you're going wildlife watching. I think Canada, I'd probably say, is leading the fore on putting that, but that I don't even know in all Canadian waters whether it's really
the
monitored.
thing in terms of direct vessel impact mammal kind of guidelines and guidance about that is the Polar Code that mariners, but there's nothing specifically tailored for tourism necessarily. And of course the issues with the Arctic is a lot of the tools that we have to kind of capture, monitor, feedback, the remoteness of where this is taking place doesn't always mean that there's not eyes in the water, in terms of deterrent about how they behave. And so again, I know Emily's mentioned it so much, but anecdotal evidence from working with communities in the high Arctic, in terms of what their concerns usually come from the fact that they've visually seen behaviors that they're not comfortable with. So yeah, the answer is there's not a lot, and what is there is sparse. Yeah, to what extent it can be enforced is but there's comfortingly there's a lot going on in this area around cruise tourism and ecotourism in the Antarctic. So it's quite, we still have an opportunity here, like in the Arctic, to actually put stuff in place, like Emily was saying, about being proactive rather than reactive to a lot of these things. And I think there's also thankfully enough evidence now to suggest that whales are impacted by activity in other areas to give the rationale to actually, like, this should be explored. So I think we also have this opportunity with communities in the Arctic being kind of, very keen to actually see this happening in their local waters. So it's about working with them again to actually make this happen, and be the drivers of that, I think, is key. But yeah, it's a really good question though, Steph, but sadly the answer is probably what you already suspected. Not so much. I see Alison's very quickly as you put a question about when this is coming out. The answer is hopefully soon. It's stuck with the final, if it's like reviewer 2 curse of like just not getting it. Of course, it's been over Christmas and everything, so it's just hanging with the editorial board and stuff. So, but as soon as we do, we can potentially actually share it through ScAn as well. But we'll make sure it's.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure it's on the ScAn Twitter. I'll send it to Daria and Will and Lauren. And if you follow me on Twitter as well, I will be shouting about it on there. Yeah, so hopefully, like, before June, like, I'm reasonably confident it could be. But yeah, hopefully soon. But do drop me an email if you're wondering where it is, and I can probably just send you a draft a document.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. My new Twitter update seems to not allow me to like or react to messages and Teams. I don't know if that's the same for everybody else, but I can't seem to. So I wasn't being rude. I would have really liked everybody's comments and stuff on there. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. And I will, obviously, thanks, Emily, for coming on. Norma, good morning. Very early. I think the award for early enthusiasm, being on the west coast of BC, goes to Norma.
No, I'm actually in Ottawa, so that's why it's only 7 a.m. here.
I saw you join. I was
my
like,
BC
wow.
colleagues, they're quite intrigued, so I'll keep them. I'll summarize the work.
I was going to say,
awesome.
So I've said we can send the link to Sonia and stuff at Transport, so we can make that available as well, Norma, if they want to watch.
Awesome, fantastic, thank you. An awesome presentation, Emily. Congratulations, that was fantastic.
Oh, thanks, Norma. Thank you. I'm glad it was useful. It's the first, like I say, me and Lauren have been really fascinated by what we've found with all these understudied stocks and stuff, and we've been excited about it, but whether or not the rest of the world.
Of course,
it's great to finally share it with people. Yeah.
So just one last plug for our next seminar coming up, and I know I see Daria's shared it in the chat, but if anybody is interested or has any more thoughts or questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with Emily or myself about the topics of whales and Arctic shipping. Always good to hear from people. So yeah, and thank you, Daria and Will, for organising.